Your Turn to Die has come a long way since the introduction of the first chapter. Before the beep-boop robots and mad scientists and complicated contraptions that have come to define the later stages of the game, the Kimigashine we knew was one of supernatural horror, talking paintings, bleeding ceilings, crying teddy bears, and living dolls. But none of it ever completely overstepped the boundary into fantasy. Smoke filled the room after the laughing doll was put together, so it easily could have been swapped with a real person. Maybe the paintings were just screens. The crying teddy bear was part of a puzzle, so maybe some mechanism was used to sense when its tears were wiped. After all, a technological answer was never out of the realm of possibility, given we've already been presented with the collar devices. At the same time, it really pushes the boundaries between science fiction and horror fantasy at times. What about these little shadow hands that kidnap Sada? What about the faces that appear from the darkness during the birdcage game? As much as you want to believe everything is explained by technology, there's an underlying, inescapable specter of the supernatural. And yet, in the early part of the game, whether it be supernatural or scientific, nothing we see strays too far beyond believability. There's a gritty groundedness that keeps us from lingering too long on it and roots us in the situations of the characters. So we come to accept the more surreal aspects, and we find a place between reality and unreality, which feels very fitting for how the characters feel, having been thrust into this bizarre, deadly circumstance. There's a shift in this aspect, and it starts with a jolt. What the hell are these things? No, like actually, the Wrigglers, as Miley calls them, are the perfect fusion of horror, supernatural, and technological. On one hand, they look mechanical. On the other, they are absolute nightmare fuel, like creatures from the abyss coming to drag away our best friend from whence they came. And in a sense, that's exactly what they do, because the next time surreal horror rears its head, it takes the shape of Joe. Before we move on, I want to define what it is exactly we're talking about, and luckily there's a word used in the art world that's not too far off via Wikipedia. Magic realism, or magical realism, is a style of literary fiction and art. It paints a realistic view of the world while also adding magical elements, often blurring the lines between fantasy and reality. Magic realism often refers to literature in particular, with magical or supernatural phenomena presented in an otherwise real-world or mundane setting, commonly found in novels and dramatic performances. Despite including certain magical elements, it is generally considered to be a different genre from fantasy, because magical realism uses a substantial amount of realistic detail and employs magical elements to make a point about reality, while fantasy stories are often separated from reality. Magical realism is often seen as an amalgamation of real and magical elements that produces a more inclusive writing form than either literary realism or fantasy. This describes the hallucinations of Your Turn to Die perfectly. Real-life trauma doesn't typically present itself in the form of creepypasta illusions with autonomy, yet it seems to be a rule of this game's world. Multiple characters experience this exact phenomenon in one form or another. Even still, it's not too far from reality, and it represents a very real human experience. In essence, it's a storytelling device to communicate the complicated experiences of the characters to the reader in a way that's gripping and relatable, even if it's steeped in unreality. In Sada's case, it packages up her guilt over Joe's death, her inferiority complex and how she feels like she's failing to save anyone, and the temptation to give in to the absurdity of fate. I will discuss this in more detail when the time comes to analyze Sada's character, but these hallucinations could have easily served the limited use as a metaphor to explain the psychology of Sada Chidoin. Why did the story need to make it a recurring aspect of the game's world that separates it from our own? The reason is, of course, thematic, as are most deliberate choices in how fiction is presented by a skilled writer. I want you to envision a folder, like a computer folder, or even a physical one, if that helps you understand the analogy. This folder is labeled Humanity. This is the most broad theme of Your Turn to Die. Open that up, and inside there's another folder called Connection. Don't worry, we'll get to all of these, but I want you to open that one up too. Finally, there's a file labeled trauma.theme. Menacing, I know, but bear with me. Trauma isn't something that can be outright overcome. There's no aha moment. It's easy to misinterpret the Joei scene this way, but that's not quite what's happening. That experience provided Sada the clarity of mind to understand her trauma and move forward in a more healthy way. Regardless, though trauma doesn't disappear, there are ways to mitigate its harm on oneself and others. And what Your Turn to Die argues is that this is done through human connection. Whenever Sada is going to give in to the horrors of her psyche, she is always pulled from the brink by someone who is willing to connect. For example, when she hallucinates the vengeful spirits of the Death Game's casualties and is about to lose herself, but Gin takes notice and rushes to save her with his simple love. Just seeing what's in front of her now, what she can still save, and that there are those who love her even though she doesn't love herself, is enough. But before that, at the very beginning of the chapter, we have this scene where Keiji comforts her while relating himself to her experiences. This is where the law of hallucinations comes in. Everyone has their own struggles. Everyone is carrying sins. For Sada, she feels responsible for Joe's death. For Keiji, he killed his role model. But as long as they don't keep their hearts at a distance, as long as they can connect, they can both stay grounded in reality and face the future. Shifting gears, there's a moment where there's an apparent ghost in the medical office. Sada goes to investigate and sees this. At first she thinks she is hallucinating again, and then Safalin appears to reveal it's actually a doll, and here the true nature of these things is finally explained. They're an invention of the organization, created for mental relief, such as talking to a lost loved one. Here we have all the genre aspects we talked about coalescing in one. The supernatural horror of spirits and living dolls, the science fiction of sentient robots, and the groundedness in the human experience of dealing with trauma and grief. The blurriness between supernatural and technological persists, as the dolls in the minigames really tread the line between android and magical fantasy monster. Speaking of which, why do you think they chose the word doll and not android or robot? Hold on to that. Dolls are central to what Your Turn to Die tries to say. They are the perfect symbolic manifestation of all its themes and everything it means. As presented in Your Turn to Die, they walk the line between supernatural, technological, and human. Let's hone in on that last element. Dolls are typically included in the discussion of the uncanny valley. Let us turn once again to our good friend Wikipedia, this time to the subject of the aforementioned. In aesthetics, the uncanny valley is a hypothesized relation between an object's degree of resemblance to a human being and the emotional response to the object. The concept suggests that humanoid objects that imperfectly resemble actual human beings may provoke uncanny or strangely familiar feelings of uneasiness and revulsion in observers. Valley denotes a dip in the human observer's affinity for the replica, a relation that otherwise increases with the replica's human likeness. Examples of the phenomenon exist among robotics, 3D computer animations, and lifelike dolls. This eeriness is seen in the introduction of the vindictive laughing doll, and in the sudden appearance of lifelike dolls in Chapter 1. But when that sci-fi element of AI is introduced, that's when things get a little more complex. Our introduction to this concept comes with the monitor AI of the very first victim of the majority vote, Mishima. According to the AI, he has a memory telling him that he is just that, but otherwise feels as though he is the human Mishima. Of course, we can't 100% trust an AI at its word. A simulation of a human being doesn't necessarily think and feel like a human, they are simply programmed to respond as the human would. This is an interesting question, but one that YTTD leaves in the background. The little tidbits we do get towards it are intriguing though, and there are mixed messages. Doll characters grapple with their humanity or lack thereof, and the dummies seem indistinguishable from actual humans. Yet Sada has a different belief deep down. She puts humans above dolls. This is seen when she accepts that she will have to murder the fake Rika in cold blood to save the human Gin, and then once again to save Gin, ironically enough, During the banquet, she thinks to herself that she is sacrificing dolls to save a human, and she needs to accept that fact. She thinks this in all roots. Sada is her own character and not a spokesperson for the messages of the story, but the fact that she goes through all of 3-1 and still reaches this conclusion is still interesting to say the least. Regardless, as the game goes on, that human element becomes more and more of a prevalent factor. Earlier, I asked why they specifically chose the word doll, and this is why. Dolls are meant to, in some way, appear human, to take on human qualities, even if they really aren't. Uncanny Valley. It's in this uncanny valley that characters such as the fake Deko and Nanmaru find themselves. First, imagine being Fako, as I like to call her. You've suddenly discovered that you aren't human, and now those who you considered allies and have memories of working alongside seem frighteningly content with killing you if it means saving someone else. Sure, she's an asshole, but is she fundamentally lesser because of her origin? Then we're introduced to Nanmaru, whose entire arc is about the struggle with his humanity, and in neither route does it come to a good end. Either his misplaced self-worth leads him to slaughter to survive, or he accepts that he's nothing more than an object that can be useful to Sada and the others. That question of humanity is the central one to Your Turn to Die. How exactly is humanity defined? What makes a human human? We are presented with several perspectives on this as the game progresses. Our explicit introduction to this concept comes in the form of the dress-up doll, Ryo Ranger. Ranger was the creation of Gashu Sato and Michiru Namida of Asunaro, modeled in form after Sei Sato, Gashu's adoptive son who perished in the test to become an assassin for the organization. He was imbued with a hatred and jealousy of humans and granted only negative emotions, per Gashu's belief that what makes a human is those negative feelings. It's no coincidence that he stole the clothes off of corpses to wear them for his own, showing both his hatred of humans, relishing in their deaths, and his jealousy as he tries to emulate them. Hinako's death was the exception, as she was perfectly content with dying, which is something Rangers simply couldn't understand. Why give up being a human? You have something I want and you aren't valuing it at all. The only thing he could hold above them, that he can make them suffer, was denied. A chip allowing the doll to feel the rest of the range of emotions was developed, but never implemented. But did you catch it? Gashu's was our very first expressed position on what it means to be a human, and it's incorrect. Following a mortal injury inflicted by his father, Ranger has the chip returned to him by Namida, otherwise known as the Fallen, and receives the breadth of emotional experience he was missing. He becomes whole, and in his last moments he regrets his inhuman actions. Negative emotions do not make a human, nor do only the positive ones. Humanity isn't so simple, but to understand the pain of others, empathy, that's something fundamentally human. In Realizer, we see a doll who deep down wanted to be human, but in the primary villain of Chapter 3, Part 1, we see a human who rejects his humanity and replaces his body until he's more doll than human. His name isn't So Hiyori. He gave that human name to another human by lighting a fire in the most human trait of all, fear of death. No, he is the inhuman doll Midori, a name he took when he gleefully asked Sada to pick one for him, just like a human child names their doll. And the one canonically chosen for him simply means green, an outward, immediately visible characteristic. A name fit for a doll. Midori sees himself above humanity. To him, humans are something to be coldly studied and toyed with. According to Shin, he loves humans so much that he would break them. What makes them hurt? What makes them suffer? What pains them physically? What pains them mentally? What do they learn? What do they remember? What do they forget? He'd play with humans he got involved with until he'd exhausted them. Ironically, this is the inverse relationship of humans and actual dolls. Indeed, they are his beloved toys, and Shin his favorite. Certainly not a category he considers himself a part of. He relishes the idea of shaving off that human stench, of becoming a doll. I mean, look how much he loves his rocket punch. It can be said that, thematically, Midori represents all that isn't human. He doesn't empathize, only understands others through cold application of psychology. say. Human suffering means nothing to him but entertainment, and connecting is certainly below him. In another world, maybe Maple could have seen the best in him and made that connection if he'd only take her hand. But instead, he manipulates, abuses, tortures, kills, turns her into another experiment. Unfortunately for Midori, human trust is not afforded to those who are inhuman. In the end, he stands in frigid loneliness with nobody who believes in him. Before his death, he succumbs to that most human element, the fear of death. Precisely the mechanism he used to manipulate Sheen. But it isn't the mechanism, the tool, he thought it was. It was a real, inescapable emotion. Just like some of his body was still human, so too was his heart. Just like Realizer, his final seconds are spent as a human. Midori is an excellent antagonist. He is built up to since chapter 1, with more clues to his existence and identity before we finally meet him. He's a looming presence over everyone, some more than others, and his actions leave scars that will never heal. He is the game's closest thing to a true, inhuman monster. Besides these guys, but you get what I'm saying. Not to mention, he's just great to watch. His smug, playful attitude, his nonchalance towards the horrors he inflicts, his intimidating aura, and his appropriate downfall. It all makes for a great evil character, and it's great to indulge in that a little in a game that makes a point that there are no bad people. That's what I should talk about to end off this discussion. There's no such thing as a bad person. That's a line in the theme song of the game, Prayer. What does it mean though? Because on its face, it can't be true. There are horrible people. Indeed, people do horrible things, but what it means is that you shouldn't write off your fellow humans as simply evil when the human experience is far more complex. Sins are the result, not of some innate characteristic, but of circumstance. Even Gashu wasn't so bad at first, but he somehow found his way into the hands of an amorphous crime organization and was forced to perform and witness tragedies until it broke him. To me, the dummies prove that humanity isn't about the physical truth, but about something more prescriptive. I don't care how Sada thinks, at least as far as we can tell, they are no different from you or I despite their origin. They trust just like we do. They want to live just like we do. When Nanmaru starts to believe he isn't human, it's that emptiness that leads to disaster. When you're presented with someone untrustworthy, you essentially have two options. You can write them off as a monster, or you can make an attempt to understand, to empathize. That's what the game is telling you. If you have trust in your fellow humans, you may find that they aren't as bad as you thought, that there's actually a lot more going on. That's why, in the world of Your Turn to Die, believing in each other is always the correct option. Believing that Mishima isn't evil despite his appearance. Believing that Kai isn't just a malicious stalker or a collaborator. Believing that Alice isn't just a no-good murderer. Believing that Kana isn't just a stupid child. Believing that Keiji isn't a manipulator, and instead a victim of trauma doing his best to open up at his own pace. Believing that Kyutaro is more than just selfish. Believing that Mai is a good person forced to do horrible things to survive. Believing that Joe and Nao are good people despite tricking and almost killing everyone because it isn't their fault. Believing in Shin Tsukimi. At one point, Nanmaru argues that being human means the ability to make your own choices. The Yabusames believe that holding on to hope is what makes a human, but there's a truth the entire game points to. The ability to connect, or put more concisely, empathy, is fundamentally human. To attempt to understand others, to deign to see the best in them, and reach out your hand, that's a fundamentally human experience. No matter the size, we're all carrying sins, so don't keep your heart at a distance. YTTD is deeply psychological. It strikes at the core of the human experience, and to do that it employs magical realism, because simple realism doesn't begin to portray the irrational truth of humanity. No matter how scientifically you spell it out, no matter how well you understand psychology on a technical level, you will not understand. Only humans are stupid enough to believe in each other, and we're right to. Leave a like for the algorithm gods, subscribe for more content like this, and follow my Twitter if you feel like it. I go by Tasty Nachos, and you go by